Greatest. Marty, what do you think?
He was certainly among the greatest. The finest pure passer I ever saw was Sammy Baugh of the Washington Redskins, and perhaps alongside of him Y.A. Tittle. But ranking right with them as a great all-round quarterback, because he certainly could carry the ball as well, was Otto Graham.
Well, of course, with the absence of Otto Graham, everybody had to make adjustments, and I think the Giants really made many more than did the Browns. They picked up a couple of assistant coaches you might have heard of. Lombardi, I think, was one of them, and Landry was another one.
Vince Lombardi and Tom Landry are two of the greatest who ever coached the game. And Tom Landry changed the concept of defensive play. Time was that the defensive end had his piece of territory, the defensive tackle his piece of territory, and so on. He changed those individual responsibilities to team responsibilities, and he built his defense around the middle linebacker. And the Giants had a really good middle linebacker, a fellow named Sam Huff. He was something.
Really wasn't a bad player, and so it was the job of that man right there to stop that man right there. Wasn't easy.
Frank Gifford is a television celebrity living in Greenwich, Connecticut, but at heart, he'll always be an old Giant.
When we got here, there was an intense rivalry at the time between the Giants and Paul Brown. They played these games like 6-0, and the Giants had nothing but defense. Then Vince Lombardi came in '54 and started to put things together offensively. Lombardi realized that he had this sort of special group of guys that when your deep pass pattern man is Frank Gifford, you got a problem, because I didn't need a coffee break to cover 50 yards. Webster was our next fastest back, I guess, and this is really funny. But we beat a lot of people with a lot of slow receivers.
Lombardi devised an offense geared to the special skills of his special men, a plan which required precise timing and teamwork. Lombardi's influence was unmistakable, just as it would be in Green Bay during the 60s. Lombardi's defensive counterpart was former Giant player Tom Landry. Landry's innovative defense required an anchor in the middle, and he chose a youngster named Sam Huff from West Virginia. Huff captured the imagination of New York fans as middle linebacker in Landry's 4-3 defense. It was a position designed for aggression. Smiling Sam Huff was transformed into a menacing villain. Today, the echo of these violent days is fading, and mild-mannered Sam Huff is an executive with the Marriott Corporation in Bethesda, Maryland.
And the 4-3 defense was just being developed by Tom Landry. Fortunately, I lived in the same hotel in New York that Tom Landry lived in. And he would call me down every night and talk to me about playing linebacker, going over defenses with me. So I was really tutored almost 24 hours a day by Tom Landry. And it was developed around me, and we coordinated all 11 players on defense.
While Landry built his defense on the practice field, Paul Brown turned to his scouts in the draft to offset the loss of Otto Graham.
Greet some boys who might help next year. Bill Plum is at left, Jim Brown in the center. Brown is the Syracuse All-American, the first-round choice.
And when we drafted him, I thought he was going to be a great back. It turns out that, for my money, he's the greatest running back of all time.
Jim Brown injected some soul into the NFL. He was a man whose action footage speaks louder than words. In 9 NFL seasons, Jim Brown never missed a game while gaining more yards and scoring more touchdowns than any other back in history. Today, Jim Brown lives in Beverly Hills, California. He makes his living as an actor, although he looks like he still has a few 100-yard games left in him.
I was very happy to play for Paul Brown because Paul was very strict. He was the king. Well, there wasn't anyone that counted other than Paul. In other words, he ran a very efficient organization. There weren't any cliques. Racism didn't really play a part in it. All you had to do was deal with him. If you dealt with him successfully, then you were all right. You didn't have to worry about the other guys.
We'd try to use Jim Brown all we could because, well, as we used to say, why shoot a pop gun when you got a cannon? The rivalry then developed between, at least on the New York media's part, between Sam Huff and Jim Brown.
This thing sort of developed about Sam was keying on Jim Brown. Well, when you played the Browns, you had to key on Jim Brown. We had Andy Robustelli and Greer and Modulewski and everyone back there keying on Jim Brown.
They played a team defense based on a concept that they developed. And when they came up against the Browns, they knew I was going to carry the ball a certain amount of times, so they studied my stance, where I would lean on certain plays. They would call out numbers, and yet we would manage to beat them a few times, you know, so it was a good rivalry.
While the Browns, Jim and Paul, won their share of skirmishes, by 1957, the battle had begun to swing toward the giant defense. Still, it was always a struggle.
Dick Nolan, who was our defensive safety, little guy, Nolan, we used to call him Sticks. He didn't weigh 180 pounds. He came up and really hit Jim Brown head on and got him. It was some shot. And I came over and I picked Nolan up. And I said, "Hey, Dick, I'm sorry I didn't get there in time, but great tackle. You really got him, And he says, "Great tackle, hell." He says, "I couldn't get out of his way."
Stories about Jimmy Brown, of course, are legend. It's interesting, I think, you could look at the statistics of Jim Brown and say the guy was a great athlete. But there's really no telling exactly how great an athlete the man was.
He may have been the finest lacrosse player who ever lived. Imagine giving a guy like Jimmy Brown at 6'3" and 235 pounds a stick. And he was a fine basketball player. He played varsity basketball at Syracuse University as well. He could do most anything. And on the football field, he was the greatest runner, as Paul Brown has said, who ever played the game.
And I think that's almost a universal feeling, too. 1958, the rivalry between the two teams maybe was as intense as ever.
Absolutely. And I think because every game was critical. And the personalities on the two ball clubs were also so outstanding, so aggressive, and so warmly felt by the fans in both cities. After all, that giant squad with Modulewski and Greer and Huff and Patton, as well as the offensive players like Alex Webster and Frank Gifford and Kyle Rote and Charlie Connolly, the personalities of those ball players lent themselves to the rivalry as well.
The Giants essentially were a conservative football team, and yet in the final game, it came down to razzle-dazzle. And what better man to do that kind of play than Frank Gifford?
In 1958, the Giants and Browns played in the final regular season game. Cleveland needed a win to advance to the NFL championship against Baltimore. With the score tied at 10, Pat Summerall kicked an unforgettable field goal to win the game and force a playoff for the Eastern Division title.
Pat Summerall kicked the greatest field goal that I've ever seen, and I think he got credit for a 49-yard field goal. I don't know how they could even measure it because we had so much snow.
It actually took a big sachet to the left and went over. Made it. And, of course, then we had to come back the following week to play again.
In the playoff, another fateful play occurred. A reverse to Frank Gifford ended up back in the hands of Charlie Connolly, who scored the game's only touchdown.
Webster took the ball on a 28. I came back from my short flanker spot, and I was hoping, against hope, that whoever this defensive end was would do what he had been doing in the movies, that is chase Webster, because if he didn't and came upfield, I might have been in semi-retirement. Webster gave me the ball, and sure enough, he went whistling by me, and I caught somebody out of the corner of my eye, and it was Charlie. And so I just turned around and flipped it to Charlie, who was about 38 at the time, and he was shocked that he had the football.
I was just hanging around out there, and he threw the ball to me. I was surprised as much as the 70,000 people in the stands to get the ball. And I ran it over, nothing, no speed or nothing, and 42 for Cleveland, same as my number. He tackled me right on the goal line, and he said some unkind word for you lucky old man or something. And after that, I told Frank, once I give you the ball, please don't give it back to me. That was the only touchdown we scored that day, but we beat them 10-0.
Cleveland was left behind. as the Giants went on to play the most memorable game in NFL history. Baltimore's sudden death victory over New York signaled the beginning of a new age for pro football. The television boom spread a network of coaxial cables from the stadiums to every living room in America, and nothing was ever the same. The teams still played, but the rivalry was dying.
Well, there will be rivalries that generate in pro football as long as pro football is played. I don't think they'll ever be as intense or maybe as dramatic as the Cleveland Brown New York Giant rivalry. Well, I think that period was much more enjoyable for the players. I feel sorry for some of the players today with the pressures that they have and the pressures they put on themselves. The tremendous amounts of monies involved, I think, quite frankly, in many cases, dictate whether a player is going to go out and play. He's running on $250,000 knees, and we were running on 2-bit knees.
I played because I liked to play. Didn't make any money, really.
I made a lot of friends in football who I still see. And we reminisce about the good years, which we had some.
My life, my love, my loyalty, my family was a New York Giants.
But the camaraderie was there.
I enjoyed it. It stimulated me, and I think it was one of the reasons that I was able to play 9 years without missing a game.
But I respect and am proud of them.
If any rivalry is only as good as the men who give it heart and soul, then this must have been one of the very best.